Hello and welcome. Could Hamas be a key to peace between Israelis and Palestinians? In spite of the US condemning the democratic elected organization as terrorists and Israel launching a prolonged military campaign against Hamas in Gaza, there are those who feel there cannot be a solution without Hamas in peace talks. The argument for dialogue gains weight with the backing of a former US president who's been willing to take on the critics and controversy as he continues to staunchly campaign for peace in the region. In his book, We Can Have Peace in the Holy Land, a plan that will work, former President Jimmy Carter argues that despite the recent violence between Israel and Hamas, the conditions are right for a peace deal. Well, for more than 30 years, Jimmy Carter's worked on building peace in the Middle East. The 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel paved the way for later agreements with Jordan and the Palestinians. So as a new US president takes on the challenge of finding a resolution, what advice does President Carter offer? Will it be received willingly, and why is he hopeful now when the two sides seem further apart than ever? Remember, you can join in our conversation with your questions and comments. Log into livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room, and you can take part in the debate. And we, of course, welcome your phone calls on the show. President Carter, it's an honor to speak with you again.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So you've been saying positive things about President Obama's approach to peace in the Middle East, but your views with him seem to diverge when it comes to the issue of Hamas. You've advocated, including Hamas, or talking to Hamas, where he's taken the line of the previous administration that Hamas shouldn't be in the peace talks.
Well,
do you think he's wrong?
In the United States now, it's not possible to move immediately into discussions with Hamas. But my position is not completely different from Obama, because I realize what I just said is true. But there's no way to have a permanent peace in the Middle East without the inclusion of Hamas. The first step, as far as the Palestinians go, will obviously have to be a reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah. And I think all of the Arab world, and I think the Palestinians, both sides, want to see that done. So far, as you know, it's been objected to and obstructed by the United States and Israel. That may change, at least on the United States side, in the next few months. The other thing is that that I've seen that Hamas is willing to have some flexibility in their previous position. They have told me and announced publicly on this TV station last April that they would accept any peace agreement negotiated between Abu Mazen and the Israelis if the agreement was submitted to the Palestinians in a referendum, and if the Palestinians approved it, or if there was a unity government that could approve. So that opens up a door to an absolutely necessary fact, and that is that Hamas has got to be involved before the peace can be concluded.
Sir, you met with Hamas for a second time this past December and said it was putting all of its eggs in the Obama basket. What do you think that Hamas hopes is possible under President Obama that wasn't under President Bush?
I would say just a basic change in everything. One is that neither that President Bush didn't start working on the Mideast situation until toward the end of his term. And the other thing is that when he did start working on it, the United States played a very dormant role, pretty well approving or accepting what Israel was doing by increasing massive numbers of settlements, increasing the number of checkpoints, and continuing to build the separation barrier, or the segregation wall as it's called. So I think that Obama will have a much more balanced point of view. Also, in the previous 16 years, most of the envoys for the president in the Middle East have been openly and publicly committed to Israel's side. Some of them have been professional lobbyists for Israel. George Mitchell is a different person, and he will be objective and fair. He's a tough negotiator. He was able to bring peace to Northern Ireland, which everybody thought was impossible. And he's on the way over there now for a fact-finding tour. I gave him a copy of my book at his request, and I gave my first copy of the book to President Obama. So I think that at least they understand my points of view. But I don't think there's any doubt that with this new administration in Washington and a new approach, that we'll see move toward peace. The other thing is that it's coming down to a choice between one state and two states. Right. And as I describe in one of the chapters in my book, a one-state solution would be a catastrophe for Israel, because with only one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, you would at this moment have a majority of non-Jews in the population. And you would very soon, in just a few years, have a majority of Arabs, and it's very likely that you could no longer have a Jewish state, or the Israelis would have to force the Palestinians to leave the West Bank, or they would have to have a nation within which part of our citizens couldn't have a vote. So none of those things are attractive even for Israel.
Is there anything left for there to be a two-state situation? Gaza's in ruins, the West Bank's fragmented. There's not much left, really, for the Palestinians.
I think obviously Gaza can and will be rebuilt. Gaza has been very resilient. I hate to see it happen. The Carter Center has a full-time office in Gaza. We know what's happening there. But Gaza will be rebuilt. And I think that the proposal by the Arab nations is the key formula that I personally espouse, and it's completely compatible with the final stages of the so-called international quartet's roadmap for peace, and it's also compatible with the official policies of the United States and the United Nations resolutions and the Geneva Accords. That is, Israel withdraws from the Palestinian territories in exchange for peace, and with the accommodation for the right of return and also for Jerusalem. And those things can take place. I think that there's one degree of flexibility that I would espouse, which I do in the book, and that is that let Israel have a small part of the West Bank, that right around Jerusalem, so they can retain about half of their settlers in the West Bank, but not deep in the West Bank. And then in exchange for that, let an equivalent amount of land be given to the Palestinians. And I would personally like to see a corridor between the West Bank and Gaza. It's about 35 miles, about 50 kilometers. And even Ariel Sharon, when I talked to him in 2005, said that would be a good idea. So that's a kind of exchange that can take place only through good faith talks.
Now, in terms of Hamas, with your meetings with them, obviously you take a lot of flack for that. Do you feel Hamas can be trusted, that they would? Of course, they're always portrayed as never sticking to ceasefires, that they are pretty much part of the problem. Israel certainly portrays them as the main reason the ceasefire ends.
Well, I know what happened in this last ceasefire. I was the one that helped to orchestrate it. When I went there in April, I asked Hamas to accept a ceasefire just in Gaza. Their first position was no, we'll only accept a ceasefire with the entire Palestine, that is Gaza and the West Bank. I knew that Israel would not accept that. So they finally accepted, okay, we'll accept the proposition that you put forward to us, Mr. President, that is Gaza ceasefire only. I relayed that information to the chief negotiator between the Hamas and Israel, Omar Suleiman, head of security in Egypt. And he pursued that proposition and finally reached an agreement late in May, about a month to 6 weeks later. And the agreement was that they would stop all attacks on each other, that Hamas would stop all the rockets, and that Israel would open up the supply line going in to supply food and water and medicines and fuel to the 1.5 million Palestinians. That was the agreement. Hamas kept their promise. I would say 99%. 3 months, there was just one mortar round or rocket fire. There's no damage done. But Israel did not keep their promise on opening up the supply lines. They only increased to about 20%. And so, but still, Hamas kept their promise until the 4th day of November, at which time Israel attacked Gaza militarily because they claimed that there was a tunnel being built. It turned out that the tunnel was completely within the walls of Gaza, and there are probably 1,000 other tunnels between Gaza and Egypt. But that was what precipitated the breakdown in the ceasefire.
So, as you know, on this show we give the viewers a chance to question you as well. And we've got a call on the line from the UK. Howard, what would you like to ask President Carter?
Yes, Mr. Carter, while I commend you on what you've said about the occupied territories, I feel that in your book and your public remarks, you have failed to understand the extent of discrimination that Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, living in Israel proper, suffer from. And I would suggest to you to ask Al Jazeera for a copy of that 2-part documentary called Palestine Street, because the second part of that documentary has hard evidence of the kind of persecution and discrimination that Arab Israeli citizens suffer from. You seem to think that it's a beautiful democracy and they have all these democratic rights.
Howard, let me put that to President Carter.
I don't deny that, you know, but when I wrote my controversial book, that is Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, I specifically oriented it toward Palestine, the occupied territories, and not Israel. And it was Palestine peace, not apartheid. Well, there's no doubt that within Palestine there is apartheid. And I defined apartheid in the book. Apartheid is when two different peoples occupy the same land when they are forcibly segregated one from another and one dominates the other. That's actually what's happening in Palestine. But I specifically refrain from including Israel in that book. But I know what's happening in Israel. I've read the documentaries, seen them, and I've read the books about it. There's not an equality of opportunity or citizenship in Israel, but for nothing else, just the ownership of land.
Before I take another call, did that controversy with the first book force you to really hold back on the second book? Have you had to bite your tongue?
No, the second book is a formula for peace. And it describes the 30 years of history under different presidents, beginning with me and down to what's happened. It describes the choice between a one-state and a two-state solution. And it spells out the compatibility among all of those different elements that I described to you, the official position of the U.S., the United Nations resolutions, the Arab position, and so forth, that they're all exactly the same, and the fact that peace is possible. That's what I tried to do in the second book. But it wasn't to describe the devastating status of the life of Palestinians under occupation.
Well, let's get Ayun on the line from Switzerland. Thanks for your patience, Ayun. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi, it's Arun actually.
Arun, sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Sir, is there any evidence to suggest that Barack Obama will join the international community in recognizing that the state of Israel is an occupying power and that her occupation is a fundamental violation of international law? Will he do something as simple as that? Is there any evidence to suggest that whatsoever?
Okay.
Thank you.
I believe he will. I think every president since I was in office has officially agreed with the United Nations resolutions, which says emphasize the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war. I'm quoting directly from the preamble to it. And all of us have agreed too, in official U.S. policy, that Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories. The fact is that very few of the presidents have been willing to confront Israel's forces in the United States, politically speaking. I think that Obama has done more than anyone else in recent years in saying, I'm going to start immediately as soon as I get in office working on this. And his choice of an envoy has been very significant, because if you look back at the U.S. envoys that have been in the Middle East, in charge of the Middle East in the past, almost all of them have been highly and closely affiliated with Israel, sometimes even professionally working for Israel. But George Mitchell is a balanced and honest broker compared to the others, and I have high hopes that he will be the key representative of Obama, and that Obama will take a balanced position, which is what the international community does and what the official position of the U.S. government is.
A very quick thought before we take a break, sir. Do you think that Barack Obama's silence during the pre-inauguration period when Gaza was in flames has hurt him in any way?
I don't think he was silent. I know the day that I came to Washington to meet with him, I think the 6th day of December, when I met with him at night, he pointed out that he had made a public statement condemning the suffering of the women and children and others under attack in Gaza. It wasn't as strong a position as I may have made, but it was stronger than any of his predecessors would have made.
Right. So we're going to ask you more questions in a moment. We have to take a short break now. More of our discussion with former U.S. President Jimmy Carter in just a moment. As we pause, let me remind you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. We're taking a poll in there to find out if you think a two-state solution is still possible. We'll be right back.